remember I was sitting at a laundromat and I was writing in a journal and I wrote, I want to be a storyteller. Like, I didn't know what it would look like, but I just knew that my life needed to revolve around this idea of telling and sharing stories. Don't rush into it in the sense of like rush to publish, rush into it as far as like for excellence. I don't necessarily think I would tell someone to go where their passion isn't leading them. You know, if you want to tell a story, if you have a story that's burning inside of you, share that story, tell that story, write that story. Every time that I sit down to write, I'm asking myself, could I do that? So that's kind of the driving force for me, is to be able to say, this is a worthy book.
Hey, Chandler Bolt here, and joining me today is Stephen James. Stephen is a critically acclaimed author of 18 novels and numerous nonfiction books that have sold more than 1 million copies. He's the host of a podcast called the Story Blender Podcast. And his latest book is called The Broker of Lies, comes out April 11th, 2023. There's a decent chance by the time you're listening to this or watching this, it's come out. So we'll talk about that book, how you can get it and all that stuff. But then we're also going to dive into, I mean, there's a lot to unpack, but 18 novels, 1 million copies sold, storytelling, all that good stuff. How do you do it? We're going to learn from the man. So Stephen, welcome. Great to have you here.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here. Thank you.
So I guess at the start, why books and why predominantly fiction? Like obviously you've dedicated a lot of your life to this. Why books?
When I was a kid, I actually grew up, my uncle would tell us stories whenever I was a kid. So we would get together at Christmas, New Year's, and things like that. And he would take the kids into a corner of the room and he would kind of get this look in his eye. And he said, I'm going to tell you a story. And we were transported. We were no longer in the living room. We were swashbuckling with pirates. We were sailing over the desert on a flying carpet or staring down a dinosaur somewhere in time travel. And so anyway, I fell in love with stories and just imagination. And then, of course, I started reading, my own whenever I started to read, and I just fell in love with it. And so I remember when I became a camp counselor, when I was like 18 years old, coming out of high school, going to college, I was looking for a way to get my kids to settle down at the end of the day because they're jumping off the bunks and everything. So I was like, one night I was like, I'll tell you a story. And so they're like, all right, they sat down and listened. And I told them one of my uncle's stories, right? And they went to bed and I was like, I'm good. I like put them all to sleep. That's amazing. And then I thought, wait, no, they actually all went to sleep. That's not amazing. So and then I started to basically tell stories to the kids, at night. And I finally ran out of my uncle's stories, had to start my own. And maybe a year later, I remember I was sitting at a laundromat in between camp sessions. I was writing in a journal and I wrote, I want to be a storyteller. Like, I didn't know what it would look like, if it would be writing stories, telling stories, but I just knew that my life needed to revolve around this idea of telling and sharing stories. And so, yeah, long story short, when I got a master's degree in storytelling and then started to travel and tell, but I had 3 little daughters at the time and I didn't want to be gone 100 or 200 days a year, so I basically started to write stories at that time. I'd still travel and tell stories, but started to write. That was in 2001, I guess, now that I think it's a long time ago. I started writing novels in about 2007. And so, yeah, and I still love to travel and tell. And now my kids are all grown, of course, but that was kind of the move from telling stories to actually writing. Had to do with my little daughters at home.
Yeah, that's so fun. That's a fun story. So talk to me about, you're telling stories, and then in 2001 you start writing stories, and then I think you said 2007, 2008 you actually, finally write and publish your first book. What was the spark, or was there a spark to say, all right, I'm actually going to put this into a novel and then publish that novel?
The spark was actually anger. So I was reading a novel. I don't remember what year, day, or anything like that, but I was reading this novel that everyone had been talking about. And I got to the end and I was like so mad because it wasn't amazing. I'll just say that. And I actually threw it against the wall. And I was like, if that's the best that's out there, I can do better than that. And then I had this little voice in my head say, oh yeah, prove it. And I was like, crap, now I got to prove it. So that was kind of the motivation to write my first novel. I tell people rage against mediocrity. Like if you're going to go this route, if you're going to tell stories, you're going to write books, write novels or whatever, it's like, it's not super hard to write a really mediocre or terrible novel or whatever. But I want people to totally strive for excellence. And so I started to write. I had been doing some nonfiction books with a publisher, and I went to them and I said, I kind of want to do a novel. I feel like I want to tell this big story. And I was like, do I have to write the whole thing first before you look at it? And they said, well, send us 50 pages and we'll look at it. And so then I sent 50 pages of The Pawn, my first novel, and then they gave me a 3-book deal. So that was kind of the start of me writing novels at that time. And that was back in, about 2000, I guess, 7 or so. And so mainly since then, I've been doing novels, although I still do some books on the craft of writing, and I've done a few other nonfiction books. But I would say for the last, 15 years, it's been mostly focused on fiction.
Cool. And so I think something I'm hearing, because I feel like this comes up all the time, is if you're reading a book and you're thinking, gosh, I could write a better book than this, then that might be a spark that you can channel into actually finally writing your first book. And like you said, prove it.
Yeah, prove it. That's the thing. And it takes a lot of work. Like, I don't want to make it seem like it wasn't a lot of work. Before my first novel came out, I'd written 24 nonfiction books. And then I'd also written for about 80 different journals, publications, and other books. So it wasn't like my first rodeo to write a book or to tell a story, but it was the first novel. It was the first big story that I was telling, 500 pages or whatever. And so I just want to encourage people that, whatever route they take, whether it's writing for, magazines aren't around as much as they were back in the late 90s, but whether it's, being a journalist or writer or whatever, it's like, don't totally, like, I don't know how to say it, like, don't rush into it in the sense of like rush to publish, rush into it as far as like for excellence, and, realize that your first shot or your first few shots might not be as good as you'd like. So work on it and like totally polish your craft. I remember us talking with a friend of mine named T. Davis Bunn. He's a novelist as well. And so he was telling me the story of his first book signing. So his first book had come out. He was so excited about it. And he's sitting there, and next to him was the famous author. And so there's this huge line of people over here, and there's like literally no one in Davis's line. He's like, come on, man, I wrote a book too. Like, I'll sign it for you. He's dying, And so, but then this lady starts walking toward him, very reverently carrying his novel. I think she was maybe Mennonite or Brethren or something, had like a prayer thing on over her head, or she's very reverent as she came up, right? And he could, tell that she's very serious. And she goes, "Sir, is this a worthy book?" And he goes, "Yeah, it's a worthy book." And so she said, "Would you kindly sign it for me?" So he did. He signed it for her, and she bought. That was the first book he sold in person. And I still remember that story. And I thought to myself, when he told me that story, I thought, if I ever write a novel, I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to look someone in the eye and say, this is a worthy book. I mean, it might not be your cup of tea. I write thrillers. Maybe you like rom-coms, whatever it is, that's fine. But to be able to actually say, you know what, this is worthy, this is worth your time. And so that was before I'd ever written a novel. And so every time that I sit down to write a novel today, or any book really, I'm asking myself, could I do that with this story? Could I look at someone and say, this is worthy of your time and your attention? And so again, it's just really trying to strive for excellence. That's been my kind of take on it ever since the beginning. So I'm not as fast as other people. Like, I'm not as fast of a writer. I can't like spin out books super fast, but I do feel like the books that I do are very, very much the best that I have to offer kind of the world at that moment. And so that's kind of the driving force for me, is to be able to say, this is a worthy book.
That's great. I love that. You're such a great storyteller. I mean, I can tell why you write such great books, because you tell great stories. Talk to me about, you kind of gloss over this. You're like, oh yeah, I wrote 24 nonfiction books and then I got into fiction. Were you writing, like, were these books that you wrote for yourself? Were you ghostwriting books for others? Like, what was that experience, and how did writing those 24 nonfiction books help you write better fiction?
Quite a number of them were educational books. Like I mentioned earlier, my master's degree was in storytelling. So I did a series of books on telling stories to children, educational storytelling. I did some inspirational books over that course of time, some collections of short stories. I would say some collections of short script. So quite a variety of kind of different types of stories. I didn't do any ghostwriting at the time, I don't think, or maybe I did one or two projects, but really for me, even from the very start, when I sent my very first story into a magazine, this is back in probably before you're born, but it's back in the 90s. I'll just say that. Okay. So anyway, I sent it in and everyone told me you're going to get rejected. You're going to get rejection letters, and all this. So I was like, I'm just going to send it in. Like, I don't know, maybe I will. And so this magazine bought this story and I was like, that's amazing. Like, I heard I was going to get rejected a million times. And so over the years, I have gotten rejected a million times, but I've found that the pathway to publishing and the pathway to success is really telling an amazing story. Like, if you can tell a great story, people will want to read what you write, people will want to publish what you write, and all of this kind of stuff. And so anyway, so my perspective has always been focus on the craft, focus on the story, like the very best that I can do. And so really those years from 96 to 2005 or so were really training to be a storyteller, a writer, a novelist, and so on. And so yeah, I think a lot of people rush into it, like they hear about, oh, I could write, a story. And so they pick up a book or two on writing and then they rush into it and write something. And it might not be at the quality that they want to send out into the world yet. So in that regard, I like to tell people, just press pause for a moment, make sure that this story really rocks, and then, kind of send it out there into the world,
That makes sense. And so
Yeah.
do you have, for people who kind of want to write both, do you have I know this probably varies based on the person, but do you recommend one or the other? Like, would you say, hey, write a nonfiction book first, then write fiction and kind of develop your writing chops? Or what do you think is the best path there?
I mean, I don't necessarily think I would tell someone to go where their passion isn't leading them. And so if your passion is, I think of it this way, if you want to tell a story, if you have a story that's burning inside of you, share that story, tell that story, write that story. If you have a message you're trying to get across, write nonfiction. That's what nonfiction is there for. It's there to, spread a message. But I think what some people do is they start with an agenda. I want to convince people to whatever it is, whatever social, political, religious agenda it might be. They're like, I want to write this story to convince people to agree with me. Well, what happens when you do that is it becomes agenda driven, and almost when people read it, they're like, oh, come on, I get it. You want me to, agree with you about whatever topic it is. And so I always tell people to start with not a message, but a dilemma. So a question you're asking, if you're writing a novel, let's say, so like a really interesting dilemma, like what's more important, telling the truth or protecting the innocent? So like that was the dilemma that drove me to write one of my novels. Instead of writing a book about how important it is to protect the innocent or how important it is to tell the truth, which everyone would agree with, like, yeah, obviously we should do that. But what if you have to choose, like, where do you go? And so I think that stories rely on drama and drama relies on tension. So if you have no tension, your story will have no drama. So really, but if you're burning to get a message out into the world, fantastic. That's great. It's probably fits better into nonfiction. I was speaking with a writer, and I think he mentioned that the Arapaho Nation has a saying that all stories exist out there in the world, and sometimes a story will find you. And when the story finds you, it's your job then to share it with the world. And I kind of like that. I think that's sort of cool. And that's been that way for me sometimes, where sort of like this story finds me and I'm like, I don't know where it came from. I don't really need to question. It's just like, it feels desperate to be told. So if you have those stories, I feel like like those that you feel like are desperate to be told, then I would definitely pursue that direction instead. Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot, because a lot of times, people come to us thinking about doing both, and there's no one size fits all, but a lot of times we'll say, hey, if you have kind of this nonfiction pool, write that book first, and that's going to teach you the process. Because as you know, learning how to write a book is kind of like learning how to ride a bike. Once you know how to do it, you can just keep doing it. And so, we've got the fiction side of the company and we've got the nonfiction side of the company, and Rami or Ari Vance runs the fiction side. And so we always joke that real authors write fiction.
Interesting.
Because it's way harder, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's you've got to be good at a lot of different things: storytelling, like you said, conflict, character development, like all of these things to create a compelling fiction book. Whereas, and I'm saying this as a nonfiction author, the nonfiction side of things, I think, is just a lot more straightforward, and you can get away with maybe not as good of writing if your content is really good. Where if I'm teaching really good stuff, well, I can still create a raving fan in that book, even if I'm not as advanced in my writing career as maybe I'd want to be. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know if I would say writing nonfiction is much easier than writing fiction. I guess for me, they're both a challenge, just to be honest. Over the years, I've written a number of books, number of books, and there's different challenges about each. I would say, interestingly enough, when I was doing my master's degree on storytelling, I was doing research on this idea of the difference between fiction and nonfiction, right? And a lot of people would say fiction is made up, nonfiction is true. That's kind of the bent out there. And so then I would ask people, well, why is poetry considered nonfiction? I mean, it's probably made up. It might be true, but it's made up. And also, graphic novels are considered nonfiction. So if you write a novel with no pictures in it, it's fiction. If you include pictures, now it's nonfiction. Comic books are nonfiction. So the comic book about Spider-Man, let's say, would be nonfiction. But if you wrote a novel about it, that would be fiction. Screenplays are considered nonfiction, as are plays. So the play, if you were to write your story as a play, it would be considered nonfiction. If you write it as a novel, it would be considered fiction. And so how would it be that, screenplays, plays, comics, graphic novels, poetry, joke books are nonfiction, even though they're made up? So how could it be that fiction is what's made up, nonfiction true? And so I was confused by that, but then I did some research on where the word fiction comes from, and it's from a Latin word which means to shape or craft. And so that you would talk like a potter would like fictionalize a pot. He would shape it. And so really, at least at the beginning, to fictionalize something wasn't to make it not true. It was to make it excellent. It's like they would fictionalize it, would try to shape it in a wonderful way. And so I feel like no matter which direction you end up going, telling an amazing story, let's say that you have a nonfiction book, it's a how-to book. Let's say how to be successful in 5 easy steps or whatever it might be. Well, odds are you're probably going to be including what within your book? Probably stories. Like you'll have your tips and tricks and techniques, all of that, but you'll probably tell stories maybe about people who have failed or who have succeeded, whatever it might be. So for me, I always drive back. I always default back to this idea of, can I tell this as a great story? And then, think, okay, where does it fit? Is it a screen? Is it a script, a how-to book, a novel?
So it starts with the story and then the form, and then figuring out the format from there. I like that. I hope you're loving this episode so far. So if you're serious about writing and publishing your book, we would love to chat with you and help create a custom plan. All right. So all you need to do right now is go to selfpublishing.com/schedule. Schedule a 45-minute consultation with one of the experts on my team. All right. Let's implement what you're learning in this episode and let's see how we can help with your book. Go to selfpublishing.com/schedule. So obviously you've done a lot of work on storytelling and research, and you've got the podcast, all that stuff. Do you think storytellers are born or made, nature or nurture?
I think that people have a bent in one direction or the other toward wordsmithing or storytelling. Mm-hmm. So some people are just amazing with words. So, like you'll read a sentence or paragraph, you're like, that sounds, so cool or entertaining. It's hilarious or whatever. But maybe you read their book and it doesn't really go anywhere. I feel like other people sort of have this bent. They naturally kind of feel like they know where a story might go, but they have to actually work on maybe all of the craft of the words and so on like that. And so I think it's helpful to know in your heart sort of which direction, where you have natural talent in one of those areas. And then, lean into that, but also study what you're maybe not as naturally good at. And so for me, naturally, I feel like I'm a storyteller. Like that feels right to me. Like I can tell a story, but then when it comes to actually all of the words, like to shape every sentence, that always takes me a little bit longer. But I do feel like anyone, let's say that you have some children out on the playground. One of them gets hurt, they fall down, they skid their knee or whatever. They go home and what happened? Mom says, what happened? They don't have to rehearse what they say. They don't have to write down what they say. They tell the story. I was running along and all of a sudden Joe tripped me and I flew, whatever. And then, so we are naturally have this bent towards understanding life through stories. And so some people maybe are better entertaining and sharing that story, but we kind of have this, and a lot of research has sort of supported this idea that we understand life through struggle and discovery, through struggle and tension and resolution. Even down to 18-month-old kids can understand struggle and discovery. And it's fascinating that they've done studies where they have like animated, I don't know, hill, let's say, and there's a ball rolling up the hill, and like there's a ball rolling down the hill, and they hit, and then this one rolls back down the hill or something like that. And then they'll ask people, well, what happened? And they'll be like, well, the ball was trying to get up the hill, but the other one knocked it back. And we just attribute the desire to the ball, like, you know what I mean? As if it's really trying to get up the hill, but it's like naturally we do that. And people, there's different studies like that. And people are always like, yeah, the poor ball, like it got knocked back down the hill or something. And it's just a dot and it's just a shape, but we attribute. So anyway, I would say that we have a bent in one direction or the other. We're all kind of naturally storytellers. But to understand, to really study the craft, I feel like you can all of us can improve, once we kind of study what's at the heart of a story and what's at the heart of great stories. And actually, it's interesting enough because my perspective on this has changed over the last 2 years. Like I studied storytelling. I've written 2 books on writing. I've taught storytelling around the world. But 2 years ago, I was working on a new book, The Art of the Tale, and I changed my view of what a story is. So it was pretty fascinating. So I've been kind of leaning into a different direction than I ever did for the previous couple decades of my writing.
And you changed your definition from what to what, would you say?
Well, I don't know if I would specifically state definition previous, but here's what I would say. All stories have 4 elements. Every story has 4 elements, and all great stories have 2 additional elements. So like if you can tell a story with the first 4, you can get by probably, but it's not going to be an amazing story. But if you include the second 2, you will actually elevate your stories remarkably. So kind of ever since Aristotle wrote Poetics, people have been looking at story through a temporal lens, like beginning, middle, end, first act, second act, third act, which is fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't necessarily help us when we are telling a story because it looks at story as a progression of events instead of a collision of desires. So stories at their heart are not about what occurs. That's a report. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. Stories are more about desire pursued, and something happens to get in the way, and they have to make decisions that move us past that. So anyway, we can talk more about those 6 elements if you want.
Yeah,
we can go in another direction.
Yeah, let's totally talk on that, and then I want to let's talk on that, and then I want to bring us home with some marketing and sales stuff around your book. So, sure. What are those 4 components, and what are the extra 2?
Yeah, so I mean, you'll probably say, like, Steve, this first one is not that rocket science-y. How did it take you 3 decades to come up with it? But obviously, we need a character. So we need a character, hopefully that's vulnerable, admirable, and unforgettable, those characteristics. And second is you need a setting that is in time and place. So it's geospatial or geotemporal, I would say, because it's time and place, so we can see it. So that makes sense. A lot of people would say the third thing you need is plot, but I don't necessarily agree with that. I think the third thing you need is struggle. So something has to go wrong. You don't have a story if you just have a character existing in a setting doing stuff, but something has to go go wrong? And then the fourth is that you need pursuit. So you need a character to pursue their desire around after this struggle occurs. So can you tell a story with just those four things? Yes, some stories are told with just a character in a setting who's pursuing something, struggling, and then either resolves it or doesn't. But your story, I don't feel like is going to be that memorable or powerful if it only has those sort of base elements. So the first one that you need if you really want to elevate your story is what I call the pivot. So a pivot is a moment where something is unexpected yet inevitable both. So if it's only one or the other, it's not satisfying. So in other words, let's say you're telling a story and everything is super predictable. We're going to be like, I saw that ending coming like 100 pages ago. So it's going to be boring. On the other hand, let's say you have stuff that's unbelievable. People are going to say, oh, come on, I don't buy it. That would never happen. So it's too outlandish. So without a pivot, you're either going to write a boring story or an outlandish story that people don't believe. So you have to have a pivot. And then the last is payoff. And payoff is really, is this story worthy? I mean, is this story, does it resonate? And so you can have a pivot and people are like, okay, that's unforgettable. Or you can have a pivot where people are like, the ending comes and they're like, I will never forget this story because of the moment of poignancy at the very end. So anyway, so I encourage people to write about an incredible character who's unforgettable in an evocative setting, who's an intimate struggle, pursues his resolution in a way that ends up being something we don't expect, but do appreciate. And it resonates with us long after we've read the story. So that's really, to me, what lies at the heart of a great story.
That's great. And you said the bonus elements were pivot was the number one. And what was the second one? Sorry, I missed that.
Oh, payoff. Maybe I didn't say it right, but payoff is really where the story, if it's funny, we laugh. If it's horrific, we're chilled. If it's a romance, we cry, whatever, so that it actually has an impact. It isn't just a bunch of words and a progression of things, but when it ends, it has resonance for us. And sometimes the pivot and payoff can come at the very same moment. Let's say you write a short story, and at the end, the last line is, they were all robots. What? No, wait, they were robots. I didn't know they were robots. How are they robots? But then you're like, oh yeah, no, literally, I should have seen that they were robots. And so then we remember that, that ending. So it has those two elements in the same sentence. It's possible to do that.
That's good. So I want to talk marketing for a bit before we wrap. So, 1 million copies sold of your books, both fiction and nonfiction, which I think you have a unique perspective where you can speak on both of those things. How'd you do it? And is there anything kind of big picture that's worked well?
I am literally not the best expert on marketing. Like, my publishers always want us to do lots of marketing, and I understand that. So here's my perspective. Like, I have someone that I work with who's an expert on social media and that sort of thing. So I work with this person, and I try to provide content to them. Like, it's my content, but it's like, I don't have necessarily the skills or the ability to put together a meme that is cool or whatever like that. And so I feel like lean into experts. If you can find people, obviously learn. You want a web presence that's positive and integrated across different platforms. Don't spend time on platforms that drain your soul, like a social media platform. You're just like, I can't do this. So don't do that. It's not worth the couple extra books you might sell. And look at marketing, not so much as like promoting yourself as really valuing your readers. So like, if you really believe in your books, like if you really believe these are worthy books and so on like that, when you're sharing it, you're not just promoting yourself like, buy my book. You're really saying, I really feel like this would benefit my readers. Like, if it's nonfiction, it'll help them. If it's fiction, it'll entertain them. It'll be worth their time. So I think to move the perspective away from elevating yourself toward serving your readers, I think is helpful. But you are much more the expert on marketing than I am. But so of course I do interviews, I'll do podcasts, I'll do blog posts. I think being comfortable with those things is important to be able to spread the word. So if I provide content for people, I want it to either be entertaining to them or educational for them. So like if I do a newsletter, I want it to either have something funny, maybe a story in it, a powerful story, or some tips on writing, that sort of thing. Instead of every newsletter is like, buy my book, buy my book, buy my book. And so I like to have those two things. Either it entertains them or it informs them. And And of course we want to let people know if we have that's the whole idea, let them know. But it's as a storyteller and not really as a marketer, I always have to lean into the expertise of other people to figure out what to do in that area.
I like I like what you said in changing your perspective as an author on marketing. If you believe in the books that you're writing and what you're working on, can you talk to me about, I'm sure you've probably heard of the Pareto principle. It's we get 80% of our results from 20% of our efforts, right? The 80-20 principle or the Pareto principle. Have you found that to be true with your fiction? Like, are there a handful of books that just sell disproportionately more than the other books? Or how have you seen that kind of work out?
Yeah, I mean, some of my books have sold well, some not so well. I always just look at it as like, I'm just going to dive into the next project and of course promote stuff as much as it seems reasonable, but I would say that's probably true. Some of the books that you do might, for whatever reason, and I don't know the reason exactly. This is kind of interesting, I think. What sells a book? There's one thing that sells a book: buzz. If there's buzz about the book, people are talking about it. Have you read this book? Like this, word of mouth, and everyone's sharing the word. Like, have you heard about this? Have you read this book? But what creates buzz? Buzz. Like, no one knows exactly how it gets started. Like if publishers knew, they would publish 5 books a year and they would all sell 10 million copies, and that everyone would be, if other people knew, they would like publish 1 book a year and it would sell, self-publish it or whatever, and it would sell 1 million copies. So no one really, I think, knows. And so what might work for one person at one time might not work next year. I don't know. I mean, so, keep your finger on the pulse of where things are moving. And, like 5 years ago, who'd have thought TikTok would be, selling any books? And so, keep your eye out, keep your finger on it, focus on excellence, focus on the great story, and, try to serve your readers in what you do. I think I guess that would be sort of the philosophy or principles that I try to do when it comes to spreading the word.
Cool. I like that. And it seems like you've done a great job with series. And I'm looking at up on Amazon right now, the Bowers Files books, obviously tying those together in a series. And you got a bunch of reviews on pretty much every book in that series. And that's where Rami, who runs our fiction, the fiction side of the business, talks about read-through rate and how in a series, it's one of the most important things, because what percentage of people who buy book 1 are buying book 2 or buying book 3 are continuing to kind of read through the series. And so I think that's something that we talk about with a lot of our fiction authors. But then I'm curious, because I would assume that writing or marketing another book in the series is different from, say, your books that's coming up, Broker of Lies, which, as far as I can tell, isn't part of any of the other series. So do you approach marketing those types of books differently? And is there anything that you're doing differently or testing out with the launch of Broker of Lies? I'm
trying a lot of things with Broker of Lies. It's the first of a new series, as you mentioned. I did 11 books in the Bowers Files over the years, and so sometimes once you get people who are fans of a series, obviously letting them know about new books in the series is huge. It's definitely huge. I think that a lot of times the first book in a series sells the most, just because that's the way it is. I mean, not always, but very often people will read the first book and I hope to read the second someday or whatever, and they don't get to it, or something comes up in their lives and stuff like that. So with Broker of Lies, we are doing quite a bit, I think, of trying to actually spread the word, because it is a brand new series. People don't know the characters yet. And hopefully launch the series in a positive way. As far as differences, that's actually an interesting question. Like, I don't know specifically the differences. One of the things we've found that's interesting is to give people insights into the characters. So like when you have a series, you might do a blog post. Like for a while, I had a page that was run by one of the characters in my novel. That was kind of interesting. People could see that. With this new novel, there's a character who's ex-military, really tough as nails, but he's also writing a romance novel, and he's very bad at the romance novel. Like, it's very cringy. So like Donovan reached out his hand and touched Susie's arm, the largest and most visible organ on her body. You're just like, this is so horrible. Like, this is so bad. And so, sharing snippets of some of Gunner's writing, like his romance writing, is interesting. People are like, I want to read more, like, what is that about? Like, who is this character and stuff? So that's been kind of fun and interesting to try to give them insights into some of these characters' lives.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Man, I could talk about this all day, but we'll go rapid fire with 2 final questions before we wrap. So first question would be, what's your parting piece of advice for the Stephen from, 20 or so years ago before you wrote that first book, and maybe the other Stephens who are out there thinking about writing their first book?
So what was my advice 20 years, or what would I whisper back to myself?
Knowing what you know now, what would be your advice to you from before you wrote your first book, and maybe the other people out there who are thinking about writing their first book?
I would say never fall in love with the first draft. It's so tempting to. You've written, it's your baby. Your passion, you wrote it. You spent a year on whatever you spent on it. And then you're like, this is ready to go. Press pause. Take a day or a week, whatever it is you need to do. Take a breath, go out, print it out, take a cup of coffee, go out somewhere you don't normally go and read through it with fresh eyes, and be willing to change stuff if you need to. So don't fall in love with the first draft. Yeah, that would be one.
Cool. That's great. Well, Stephen, this has been awesome. Where can people go to get your new book, Broker of Lies, and anywhere else people can go to find out more about you, your books, or whatever would be most helpful?
Yeah, I appreciate it. StephenJames.net is kind of all things Stephen James, and you can get Broker of Lies wherever you might order books or buy them online or at local bookstores. It should be available everywhere April 11th. So I hope people will enjoy it and check it out. And people can email me through my website. I always love hearing from folks, and I always do my best to respond as promptly as possible.
Cool. Check it out, guys. The new book, Broker of Lies. Grab a copy. Stephen, this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode of the Self-Publishing School podcast. I know there's so many places that you can be spending your time. There's other podcasts that you can be listening to, YouTube channels that you can be watching. So thank you so much. It means the world. Now, I want you to do 3 things right now if you found this episode helpful. I don't know if you know this, but we've got a YouTube channel. It's a companion channel to this podcast. All the video versions of the episode are on the YouTube channel. So number 1, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Number 2, if you're listening to this podcast wherever, whether this is Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Number 2, I want you to subscribe to this podcast right now so you don't miss a future episode. And then number 3, this is probably the most important, leave a review on the podcast. All right, reviews are super important and help this podcast get discovered by other people. So number 3, leave a review on the podcast. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next episode.